Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Robert Lamb and I study fish, primarily because then I can have pretty pictures to put on my slides. So I study El Nino, and what I'm going to be talking about today is how we can use El Nino as a sort of a proxy or a fast forward of long-term climate change and see how that affects reef fish communities. So this is an image most of us have seen. We all kind of know what El Nino is, right? If you didn't see Chris Farley in the 90s, he gave it a good description. It's Spanish for the Nino, but really what El Nino is normally we have trade winds that blow from the eastern side of the Pacific towards the western side of the Pacific. And those are constant. And those winds are such, in such force and such constant activity that they drive surface water all the way to the west. So the western side of the Pacific over here in Indonesia is actually about 1.5 feet higher. Sea level is about 1.5 feet higher than it is on the eastern side. And that constant blowing of winds creates what's called equatorial upwelling, which you can see in that blue sea surface temperature anomaly there. So normally in the Galapagos Islands where I work, which is right off the coast of Ecuador, that equatorial upwelling fuels this rich ecosystem full of life and really high biomass. Now when El Nino conditions set in, those trade winds start to lessen. And it's predicted that El Ninos are going to be more severe and more frequent with climate change. And so we may actually be forced into sort of a positive temperature anomaly state. And this is very important for marine ecosystems, and I'll get into that a little bit further on. So my questions for this chapter of my thesis are, how do Galapagos reef fishes respond to variation in that El Nino Southern Oscillation cycle? So here's the Galapagos Islands, about 900 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador, and this is sort of my study universe. It's about 6,000 square kilometers, or about twice the size of Rhode Island. And these sites, these 12 sites, have been monitored by my advisor in my lab for about 20 years now, and so I've been working on fish communities over the last 6 years, with the question of how El Ninos are going to affect reef fishes in the current and in the future. And so how we do this, we basically go out to each site and we use what are called underwater visual censuses to count fish along 50 by 5 meter transects. And we did this sampling in January and July, which coincide with the cold and warm seasons, every year between 2014 and 2019. Here you can see a transect tape laid out, and this is a common planktivore species in the Galapagos, Zenosis jessiae. So I mentioned what El Nino is in terms of the climate driver, but what does it look like underwater? What are the effects in the ocean? Well, this is a plot showing the El Nino cycle over the last 20 or so years, or 30 or so years. And what I'm plotting here is this oceanic Nino index. That's a value of essentially it's a sea surface temperature anomaly. So when ONI is high, that means that we're in El Nino conditions, and when it's low, we're in La Nina conditions. And we can see very clearly some of the recent strong El Nino events. The 1982-83 and the 1997-98 were two really major El Nino events that had widespread effects both in the Galapagos and elsewhere, both underwater and on land. The one outlined in that box is the 2015-16 El Nino event, which is the one that happened right in the middle of my PhD. And so this has two primary effects in the oceans. The first, you can see on the left, is a change in the availability of surface chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is a measure of planktonic productivity. It's a measure of how much food there is in the water. And the other is a measure of sea surface temperature. So we're increasing the temperature and we're decreasing the amount of food available. And again, that's all driven by the changes in the trade winds that are blowing normally from east to west. And so my primary question was, which of these two changes in the oceanographic state of the Galapagos is more important? Are fish going to die because they don't have food, or are they going to die because they're too hot? And going forward, this is a major implication, because if we want to make predictions about how species distributions are going to change or relative dominance in a community, we need to know these mechanisms. So this is a temperature plot from the 5-year period. This is actually measured in situ at our sites, and you can see there's these two peaks. This is the sort of pre-El Nino, and then the full-on El Nino with a very short cold season in between, so there was very little upwelling in that period. And then there's also two very strong La Nina periods. So we're not just talking about El Nino on one side, that's just one side of the coin. We also have these La Nina periods where the ecosystem has a potential for resilience or recovery. So we wanted to ask, how is that going to play out? And the first thing, or the most important thing that we looked at, was diet. So what I'm going to show you now is a plot aggregating biomass across species within each sort of trophic category in the community. And I'm going to be plotting this mean biomass over time. And what I've done is I've shaded the background by that ONI index. So this is essentially a measure of that sea surface temperature change over time. And what we found is that there are three groups: the herbivore detritivores, fish that eat invertebrates, mobile invertebrates, and planktivores that had a significant decrease in their population abundance relative to prior to the El Nino period. And there were two species that had a significant increase following these really cold, productive La Nina periods, which are shaded in blue. So we saw that these planktivores are both having a negative anomaly, so they're decreasing in abundance during El Nino, but they are also increasing in abundance during La Nina. So this looks like perhaps that trophic group, that group of fishes, are the most susceptible to change in El Nino. And that is very relevant in terms of this question about which factor is going to predominate. If we had seen everything changing in the exact same way across that temperature span, we would say perhaps it's temperature that's driving this. But since it was mediated by trophic level, we think it might be actually more related to their food availability. So zooming in again on these planktivore responses, we can see that some of the, well, for instance, this lowest point, when they reached the lowest point in population size, it was actually about 6 months or a year after the peak of the El Nino period. And some of these increases were 6 months to 2 years after these strong La Nina periods, which is when upwelling resumes and there's a lot more food in the water. So understanding that there's this sort of lag inherent in the system, we can actually plot this out, and it turns out that planktivore biomass is really well predicted by an average of that ONI value over the previous 21 months. And this has really significant implications for the Galapagos in general, because that means about a 7 kilogram loss of planktivore biomass, or about 30% per 1 degree warming of the ocean. And this could be a phenomenon that perpetuates in terms of long-term climate change as well. So again, using El Nino as a sort of a fast forward. And like I said, this is very important for the Galapagos because planktivores dominate this fish community. This is a rank abundance curve where we're basically plotting the relative proportion of abundance of the species relative to its rank in the community. And we see it's very steep here, and all of these species that are labeled in yellow are planktivores. And what this is showing is that these planktivores are a dominant component of the community. And we also have a sense of perhaps there's some sleeping planktivore groups. Some of these next most important in terms of abundant species we think are actually also feeding on plankton when it's available. So these might be facultative planktivores, and we're going to be getting into that with some stable isotope analyses later on. But just these 3 species of planktivores, which are the most abundant ones, constitute about 36% of the entire abundance of reef fishes in the Galapagos. And those are important for food, for higher trophic levels, for fish that are important for fisheries, for fish that are important for scuba diving tourism and attracting tourist dollars to the Galapagos. And we don't just see this in fish, we see this in barnacles and polychaete worms. This is some of the work that my advisor John Whitman does. We see all of these planktivores burgeoning in life with these La Nina periods. So there's a surprising capacity for resilience in this system even after those climate shocks. So to conclude, how do these fish species respond to the El Nino Southern Oscillation? We found that planktonic productivity, probably not temperature, is driving the majority of these reef fish population dynamics. That planktivores are the most sensitive trophic group to decline during El Nino, but also to recovery during La Nina, and that these are an important source of secondary productivity for the entire ecosystem. Thank you.